Hey there, Legal Tea listeners. This is your host, Jenny Roselle. Today's episode of Legal Tea is the Cautionary Tales topic. And on these Cautionary Tales episodes of Legal Tea, we normally talk about real-life cases, like real-life clients that usually are things me or my office have worked on, or they are things that I just think are generally good things to be aware of so that you do not turn into a cautionary tale on this podcast one day. Well, today is a little bit of both because it's a very real life story, but it's definitely something you should be aware of too. And today is also different in another regard because it's a really personal to me story involving what are called simultaneous death provisions in an estate plan. So let's dive into my personal story first. Then we can talk about takeaways and what you can learn from this episode on these things called simultaneous death provisions. Now, bear with me on this story. It's a little lengthy that takes up most of the episode, but it's very therapeutic when I talk about it. So I hope you enjoy me sharing this episode. So in June of 2014, my Uncle John, Aunt Sibby, and my second cousin Katrina were traveling by car to Washington, D.C. from their home state of Minnesota. Now, prior to leaving on their trip, my Uncle John had emailed the family, a big group of us family, stating that they would be traveling through Indianapolis on their trek home and asked if anyone would be around, kind of insinuating like a potential meetup. Several members of the Indiana family were unavailable and or out of town that specific weekend, but my great Aunt Linda, who listens to my podcast, so hi Aunt Linda, my great Aunt Linda and I had the weekend open. We then set some tentative plans, and my Aunt Sibby later confirmed, "That sounds great, guys. We should be able to make it work." Fast forward a week later, on June 21st, 2014, I was driving down Meridian Street in Indianapolis. I was heading home, and my cell phone rang. Now, if you know the area, or I guess if you don't know the area, Meridian is super busy. And when I heard my cell phone ring, I looked down and I saw that it was my Uncle John calling. And for a split second, I almost did not pick up, kind of telling myself, oh, I'll just call them back as soon as I get home. Mainly because Meridian is so busy and has super narrow lanes. Thankfully, I had a moment of clarity, and I very specifically remember telling myself, Jenny, it's your Minnesota family, just grab the call and watch the darn road. So I did. And in my Uncle John's super soft voice, he said, well, hello, Miss Jenny. And in that 15-minute conversation with my Uncle John, we chatted about work and law school. I was in law school at that time, and their time in Washington, D.C. I was so excited to see pictures. I had, at that time, never been to D.C., and I know that they would have taken great shots because they always took such great pictures. So we ended up hanging up, and I got home, and well, the purpose of the call was really just to coordinate some dinner plans. I had started getting ready, and my phone rang a second time. This time it was my cousin Jason. I picked up, and before I could even finish hello, he said, Jenny, I don't know what has happened, but there's been a car accident, and Katrina has been airlifted to Riley Hospital. Now, Riley Hospital is in downtown Indianapolis, and at that time in my life, I was living very close to downtown. So since I was the closest to the hospital, that's why Jason was calling me. And at that moment, I immediately threw on a pair of shoes and sprinted out the door to rush to Riley Hospital. To this day, I remember exactly what I was wearing, and that still gives me chills. I arrived at the hospital, walked into the emergency room, and told the individual at the front desk who I was there for. She immediately grabbed my arm and rushed me to the back. Looking back, I should have realized how serious things were in that moment. There's all these people in the emergency room, and the way they reacted when I said who I was there to see, I should have known. Anyway, I remember I was approaching Katrina's room, and my phone rang again. And this time it was my mom. Assuming she had heard the news, I picked up really quickly and said, "Mom, I just got to the hospital. They brought me back." My mom stopped me, and she proceeded to say, "Jenny, I'm on my way. I need to tell you something, but you cannot react in front of Katrina." And so she continued and said, "John and Sibby did not survive the accident." I stepped out of Katrina's line of sight and I fell to the floor. I was taken to another room to cry it out, and I don't remember if it was a few minutes or an hour, but my mom arrived and I was still crying in this room. But seeing her and her seeing me, honestly, brought the strength that we both needed to be able to toughen up and be there for Katrina. Together, we walked in Katrina's room, who was in every brace and cast I think is humanly possible. We bent down and we told her, "Aunt Judy and Jenny are here, Katrina. We aren't leaving." We stayed at the hospital for the next 48 hours or 72 hours, maybe more. Days were a blur at that point, and repeatedly we just kept asking ourselves, how did this happen? Why them? What about Katrina? And everything that transpired after the accident was, for a lack of a better word, a mess. Just a total, absolute, heartbreaking mess. Was Katrina going to be able to recover? Was she going to be able to walk again? What about John and Sibby and their estates? Did they even have wills, or, what type of estate plan? What happens now that they are both gone? What happens in a simultaneous death situation? What about the semi-truck that barreled into them? Was the driver over his allowable time on the road? Is this considered a wrongful death suit? Is the trucking company going to help cover Katrina's expenses? Do we need lawyers? Clearly, so many questions. And at that time, there were little to no answers. Now, Katrina remained at Raleigh Hospital for a few weeks and was in and out of surgeries and ended up being transferred to a hospital in Minnesota so that she could be closer to home. Fast forward today, I can happily report, first of all, it's actually been 10 years, which is just wild. But I can happily report that Katrina fully recovered from that tragic accident and is a beautiful and happy woman. She graduated high school. She was really young at the time of this accident. And she went to college, and she's just a remarkable young woman that has experienced how precious life is way too young. From when I first saw Katrina immediately post-accident in that emergency room to now, I just cannot help but to appreciate medical science. It's amazing. Settling John and Sibby's estates, however, was not amazing. John and Sibby were what I like to call a blended family. What I mean by that is John had children not with Sibby, and Sibby had children not with John. One of John's sons was the executor, the person in charge of the estate in John's will, and one of Sibby's sons was the executor of Sibby's will. Because John and Sibby had wills, their estates had to go through a probate court process, which is the court proceeding that sometimes occurs when someone passes away. Probate's often an emotional process and sometimes lengthy. And in their situation specifically, emotions were heightened due to the circumstances, right? Which consequently created an even more lengthy probate process. And then on top of that, there was a wrongful death lawsuit that was filed against the trucking company, which proceeds from the wrongful death suit would eventually enter into the estate. So as you can see, it was quite complex, and it ended up taking around a year to settle everything. In hindsight, 10 years later, I'm really surprised it did not take longer. So the purpose of sharing this really personal story is because my aunt and uncle's wills did not have what are called simultaneous death provisions in their estate plan. Because of that, it actually created some extra hurdles and headaches to determine who, in all likelihood, died second. This is critically important because their will's beneficiaries were different. After all, like I just said, they were a blended family and had their respective children as beneficiaries after each other, of course, in their wills. But since they both passed away, the unfortunate question, the kind of the million-dollar question, was who died second? So whose will should govern? Thankfully and ultimately, all of the kids ended up coming to an agreement of how things were divvied out. But you can imagine there are many families that would not be able to agree. In fact, I'd be lying if I said that there weren't some hurt feelings with my family, my cousins. Emotions were already tremendously high, then money got thrown on the table, guys. So what is a simultaneous death provision? It's a fairly simple provision in an estate plan to dictate what would happen if there are like back-to-back deaths, whether it's between, a couple or even between someone doing their will or trust and a beneficiary. Now, oftentimes the provision will say something like, okay, if we die and the timing of our deaths cannot be established, then we deem XYZ happens. And like I said, there's usually also a provision relating to kind of a back-to-back death between who did their will and trust and a beneficiary. And those provisions will say usually something like, if any beneficiary is living at the time of our death, but fails to survive, and it usually gives some sort of like very specific time frame, like 30 days or whatever, then XYZ happens. Maybe it's the lawyer in me, but XYZ is important because if back-to-back deaths happen between a couple and or a beneficiary, then we know XYZ is what's going to happen. The handy-dandy thing about these types of provisions is that it gives express direction and instruction to your executor or trustee on what specifically to do in the event something like that unfortunately happens. Rather than relying on the beneficiaries to have to agree to something, it's already spelled out. Now, something to know about these provisions is that I have to guess that there are plenty of attorneys out there that do not have a provision like this within their documents. I'd say most estate attorneys' documents do because we sort of live and breathe in this world every day. I would also make the argument that this is why when it's time to do your estate plan, you should work with an estate attorney. Not with your buddy who's an attorney but doesn't practice in this field. Not the general practice attorney that does every type of case that walks through the door. And no shame on either one of those types of attorneys, but they just don't live and breathe this world every day like an estate attorney. Now, as I start to wind down and kind of wrap up this episode, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that this year, 2024, will be the 10-year anniversary of losing my Uncle John and Aunt Sibby. Every summer, our family gets together, typically in Galena, Illinois, for a family reunion because Galena is a good halfway between Minnesota and Indiana, which is where most of our families live. And side note, if you haven't been to Galena, you should check it out. It's just the cutest town. It's impossible to not like it. And sorry, Flossie, my basset hound, decided to yawn. Anyways, it's absolutely crazy to think it's been 10 years already. It feels like yesterday. Like I said earlier, I legitimately remember what I wore when I went rushing to the hospital. It was a white and pink dress. There were like little pink flowers on it. And because I rushed out the door, I threw on a pair of tennis shoes. So I certainly did not win any type of fashion award, that's for sure. I remember that the car accident happened just a few weeks prior to the scheduled 2014 family reunion. And it was not until the 2015 family reunion that individuals were like signing paperwork to actually like settle and close the estate. The 2024 reunion is actually taking place in just a few weeks. And like I said, it just doesn't even seem real. But the accident was real, guys. And they will never be at a reunion again. Luckily, I, as well as, John and Sibby's families and, family and friends, have so many good, fun memories of them, even though their lives were cut far too short. Those memories help all of us move forward and continue on with this crazy thing called life, just without them. So that sure was a deep and personal episode. My goodness. So let's wrap up this episode and shift to a sneak peek of next week, which will be circling back to the current trends topic, where we talk about things that are going on currently that impact my estate and elder law world, or maybe they're just, whatever. So next week's episode, I'm going to say 'tis the season of people and families traveling because schools are either out or almost done. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about different triggers of people doing estate planning, as in, people often wait to finally do their plan until some type of trigger. Sometimes it's a cool trip. Sometimes it's a health event. I figured it would just be a good time to talk about those sort of triggers. And then I'm also going to make a bit of a special announcement on next week's episode as well. So tune in. Until then, be well and talk soon.